They are the galaxy's greatest nightmare. A plague without cure. A hunger without an end. And as sure as time and tide, they will return and subsume all of life beneath the waves of chaos. But what if everything that we've believed about the Flood was wrong? In today's episode, we confront a terrifying truth. That the Flood are not just a disease or a parasite. They're something much, much more sinister, much deeper, and the evidence of it has been scattered through Halo since its inception, staring us in the face, the truth presented to us in fragmented form. And now, finally, after all this time, we may finally understand the true nature of the Flood. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and this is episode 5 of the Grand Unified Theory of Halo Cosmology. In the previous 4 videos, we've broken down the true reality of Halo, where I presented the cosmological layer model of the Halo universe, effectively unifying all the forces of the Halo universe and beginning to propose the Grand Unified Theory of Halo Cosmology, Halo's equivalent of the theory of everything. We chased this with a deep dive into the nature of neural physics, immediately chased again by the true reality of slipspace and the hyperdimensional realms of the Halo universe, and how the Forerunners' mastery of this dimensional control layer was necessitated by their fear, shame, and guilt over killing their creators. And most recently we dived into ancient humanity and seemingly their at least partial understanding of the nature of neural physics, suggested by recent lore drops such as Halo Tulpomancy. In this episode, we will explore how the Forerunners' misunderstanding of the Flood as a biological threat ultimately doomed them to failure, and why even their ultimate weapons, like the Halo Array itself, was never truly going to work against the Flood. We'll look at the nature of the Flood, we'll examine the Gravemind's persistence, the failure of mendicant bias, and the cosmic horror that lies beneath the infection. We will bring numerous lore continuity errors and consistency problems to the surface, and with this, the penultimate video of our Grand Unified Theory of Halo Cosmology, we will finally understand the true nature of the Flood, and set the stage for the final part, the bias fallacy, where we explore why ultimately mendicant bias failed against the Flood, and then finally summarise and conclude this Halo theory of everything. The Flood constitutes a peril to life in the galaxy that remains largely unequalled. It is an omniparasitic species that seemingly originated beyond the borders of Forerunner civilization and was the reason for the creation of Halo, the Forerunners' weapon of last resort, specifically designed to eradicate all thinking life. And it is there that we take our first issue. The Halos don't kill the Flood, they kill their food. We knew this all the way back in Halo CE.
Halo doesn't kill Flood, it kills their food. Humans, Covenant, whatever. We're all equally edible. The only way to stop the Flood is to starve them to death. And that's exactly what Halo is designed to do. Wipe the galaxy clean of all sentient life. You don't believe me? Ask him.
Is it true?
More or less.
So the Halos don't target the Flood directly, they kill sentient life to starve the Flood of neural biomass. Now of course back in the day, we thought that the Flood were really more so a non-sentient, parasitic, virulent vector, and thus by killing their food, you stop the spread of the infection. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense once you put some scrutiny onto it, because well, a real-world equivalent would be if we wanted to kill intestinal worms, or head lice, we kill every human on the planet. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense. But then we have a lore contradiction here in that when we actually see the effects of a halo firing, it appears similar to the composer. Bodies disintegrate, essences are purged, even flood biomass is destroyed. That stands in contradiction to the earlier lore we knew from Halo CE. And then to further convolute it, we have lore that contradicts this in regards to a solute that was sprayed onto planets to dissolve the victims' bodies of the firing of the array into their component molecules, to ultimately avoid ecological collapse. But it took a couple of hundred years after the firing array for the reseeding process to take place, by which point all of the bodies would have decayed through natural processes. And you know what happens when a body decomposes? The nutrients that's contained within the body feeds the plant life around it, feeds other organisms around it. Why would they need to dissolve the bodies? And if by avoiding ecological collapse they mean they just didn't want to destroy the ecosystem, obviously that would have massively disrupted the food chain because certain predators and prey would have just keeled over and died. But dissolving their bodies wouldn't have avoided that kind of ecological collapse because it took a couple of hundred years for the reseeding process to take place, which means in those elapsing few centuries the ecologies would have collapsed anyway. And to even further complicate it, it was said in Silentium that the solute was sprayed onto planets before the firing of the Halo array. So why didn't those chemicals begin to decay life that was already there? Or is it a solute that is only activated upon undergoing the effects of the Halo? This is a very messy aspect of the lore. I mean, why fire the arrays to kill the Flood's food if they can survive in the form of Flood supercells and spores? And that would mean ultimately that when the life was reseeded on all of the planets that the Flood infected, there would be Flood supercells and spores in existence on those planets to infect beings again. Why dissolve their bodies upon experiencing the effects of the Halo if it didn't really make any odds to ecological collapse, because the actual reseeding process didn't happen until a couple of centuries afterwards? And if the Halos only kill the food of the Flood and not the Flood themselves, why do we see the Flood disintegrate upon experiencing the effect of the Halos? And if indeed the effects of the Halo do disintegrate bodies in the way that we witness them to disintegrate bodies, similarly to the Composer, why the need for a solute to dissolve decaying bodies when they're already ash? And this is really only the beginning of the contradictions. It's heavily suggested in more modern lore that the Composer does, in some way, shape or form, have an integral process within a Halo for its activation purposes. But it's also heavily suggested that the Composer itself is precursor technology that's been reappropriated by the Forerunners, similarly to both the Domain and the Guardian Custodes, which means there is an aspect of the Halo's firing mechanism which is neurophysically tuned. And we see this with some of the test firings of the Halos where they destroyed neurophysical constructs, precursor buildings and artifacts. Even the Domain itself was temporarily disabled by the firing of the Halo array, but if the Halos are tuned to neurophysical constructs, why didn't the firing of the arrays destroy the Domain entirely rather than just disabling it? Really, all of this points towards the idea that Halos only destroy things within the normal physical dimensions of space-time, the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time that we experience, and nothing beyond it. This is again enforced by the ideas that there were shield worlds that were held within slipspace bubbles, there were silexes, there were cryptums that existed within the galaxy at the time of the firing of the Halo arrays. If the Halo's effect penetrated deeper than just the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, then it would have killed any surviving Foreigners that were seeking refuge within shield worlds that were held within slipspace bubbles. It would have killed the Didact inside his cryptum. It would have killed any beings held within silexes that were within the effects of the Halo. And yet the Didact survived. And it also means that if there were any Flood aboard any ships travelling through slipspace when the Halo was fired, they would have avoided the effects of the Halo firing as well. So the deeper you dig, the more contradictions that you find in the lore. Contradictions about the nature of the Flood and how they react and respond to the Halos. Now, going all the way back to the Flood's first encounter with ancient humanity, it is at least suggested that ancient humanity created a cure of sorts, and that caused the Flood to retreat, but then the Primordial says to the Didact at a later date that they chose to stop infecting humanity in order to lull the Forerunners into a false sense of security. But that's tactically absurd. It defies the Flood's modus operandi. Why stop consuming and give your enemy time to prepare, to build the halos and to rally? What's ultimately more likely, as we covered in our previous video, is that ancient humanity's inoculation worked. The Flood could no longer infect humanity, and thus the retreat wasn't tactical, it was forced. But of course the Primordial wouldn't say that to the Didact. It wouldn't say that humanity found a cure, because ultimately that would confirm the suspicions of the Forerunners that there exists a cure to the Flood. 343 Guilty Spark muses on this himself. Now, for those who didn't know, 343 Guilty Spark is a monitor of Installation 04, but before he was a monitor, he was an ancient, devolved human by the name of Chacus. He was a friend of Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting, whom would ultimately become the ISO Didact, the replacement of the Didact. And when Chacus was injured beyond recovery, the ISO Didact took it upon himself to compose Chacus and turn him into 343 Guilty Spark. And during the years that elapsed between the firing of the Halo and humanity ultimately arriving at Installation 04, 343 Guilty Spark mused on the fact that he believed in a way that he couldn't explain that there exists a way to cure the Flood.
I know in a way I cannot logically explain that there exists a way to actually defeat the Flood. To immunize? To cure? I still struggle with multiple layers of memory of fighting the Flood. But I know this cure is possible, even though the core genius of the Forerunners was unable to achieve it. The Forerunners' ancient enemy held and used that knowledge once, but it was denied to us.
Now, he also speaks about struggling with numerous layers of memory compartmentalization. Well, that's because the monitor, the Forerunner monitor of 343 Guilty Spark, still has the memories of the devolved ancient human Chacus. They've just been compartmentalized from him to keep him on task, to keep him task focused. But Chacus himself carries a gene song, an implanted essence of a superior ancient human, one of the ancestors, none other than the Lord of Admirals, Fort Hencho Oberyn. This harkens back to the stories that humanity sacrificed 1/3 of its population, a third that carried some degree of Flood inoculation, which forced their retreat. So really, when thinking about what the Flood are and why they react to the halos and other stimuli in the way that they do, it starts to call into question whether we actually fully understand the nature of the Flood. And for me, the final smoking gun comes with the Gravemind. The Primordial on Chatham Hakor, the Gravemind beneath Delta Halo, and the voice that haunted the Didact are likely the same entity. In fact, it's not even likely, it's pretty much confirmed. The Flood's priorities for infection is to gather biomass. The more biomass they gather, they eventually form a proto-Gravemind which grows and grows and grows until a full Gravemind comes into being, which then becomes the controlling hive mind intelligence of the Flood, and then continues to perpetuate Flood infection throughout the galaxy. Which means as long as a single Flood spore exists, a Gravemind can always come back. But then when we look at the cosmological layer model that we've outlined during this series, it becomes obvious that this isn't simply a singular ego or consciousness coming back into being because a single Flood spore survives. It's not reincarnation, but informational continuity. A consciousness that doesn't require physical survival, because it is encoded in the neural substrate of the universe. The Flood are a corruption of the precursors. This is a fact written in the lore. But as we've fully explored in this series, the precursors are beyond the physical. They encoded themselves into the neural substrate of the universe. That's ultimately why, when the Foreigners rose up against the precursors, it didn't really matter to them. The precursors have inhabited innumerable quantities of physical forms over their existence, and are so at one with their technology that precursors and neural physics cannot be separated. The Primordial even makes it clear that when the Foreigners struck out against their creators simply moved beyond their reach. This doesn't mean physically beyond their reach, this doesn't mean just like leaving the galaxy, this means beyond their ability to comprehend. They returned to the neural physical substrate and could just will themselves back into existence. The neural physical layer of the universe is, as we've covered before, where the living universe exists, and where quite possibly all consciousness originates. So if the Flood is merely a corruption of the precursors, then the Flood is also a corruption of neural physics. The precursors were neural physical beings that manifested themselves through will into existence in physical form within the boundaries of the physical universe we are familiar with. Why would the Flood be any different from this? The Flood as we know them, the physical infection that torments the forms of creatures we're familiar with, is not what the Flood truly is. It's simply the physical manifestation of the Flood infection. The true reality of the Flood is that they are a corruption of neural physics, which explains why the Gravemind's consciousness can keep coming back, because it isn't bound to physical survival. Graveminds form through critical mass of cognitive density, but their ego predates the biomass. They act more like a field than a mind. They can inhabit space, data, and thought simultaneously. Their sentience is anchored through biology, but is not dependent upon it. Each Gravemind is a local manifestation of a singular, cosmic mind. The Flood form the network, and the Gravemind is its antenna, a way to interface with reality. This simple truth then begins to explain all of the contradictions. The claim that halos do not kill the Flood, but only kill their food. Well, the things that we've witnessed show the Flood bodies disintegrating upon the effects of the halo rolling over them. But with this revelation that the Flood themselves are actually a corruption of neural physics, the effects of destroying their physical bodies doesn't destroy the Flood itself, just like killing the precursors and destroying their physical bodies didn't actually kill the precursors, they simply retreated to the neural physical layer of reality. The same thing with the Flood. That's why halos don't kill the Flood. And the claim that it only kills their food, again, yes, okay, normal physical living entities are considered food for the Flood, but if the Flood itself is a neural physical entity, then even the Flood's physical form within the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time are considered a food or vector for the Flood. And in that categorization, it lines up with what we see when the halos fire. They destroy living beings that have sufficient biomass to sustain the Flood, but also destroys the physical manifestation of the Flood within the 3 dimensions of space and time, but doesn't kill the Flood itself. And for further evidence towards the idea that the Flood are a neural physical corruption, not just a physical parasite, when the Foreigners finally encountered the Flood, Forerunners fell victim to Flood infection, and the Foreigners used the Composer to destroy their physical bodies but preserve their essences, with the goal in mind of then implanting those essences into new biological bodies. This was to be the source of the Foreigners' immortality, but every time that they did it, Flood infection returned. If the Flood are a physical parasite as we believe them to be, how would that be possible? Completely and utterly disintegrating the physical body and only extracting the consciousness of the individual, and then implanting that consciousness into a new biological body, and yet that new body becomes Flood infected as well. The only way that that would be possible is if the Flood infection was not physical, but neural physical. Infected essences composed and then revived still mutate. That's not a physical infection, that's corruption persisting in non-biological form. The Flood leave traces in slipspace, AI logic, in space itself as referenced in Primordium. The logic plague and digital infection, the Flood are capable of infecting AIs. But the logic plague is not software. If it was software, then it wouldn't be able to infect biological entities, and yet the Didact had a logic plague. Cortana had a logic plague of similar substance. The Didact spoke to Cortana about this in Halo Pt.5, and ultimately was one of the major reasons that Cortana sacrificed herself in the moments before Halo Infinite, because she saw the truth that the Didact was speaking. The persistence of the Gravemind's ego across time. The fact that the Halos don't kill Flood, they just kill their food. The lack of the Halo's effect on objects inside slipspace fields. The fact that the domain was only shut down, but not destroyed entirely. The infected foreigners, composed and then reimplanted, still exhibiting Flood infection. The fact that the Flood can give the logic plague to both living entities and AI suggests infection is more fundamental. The universe itself, space and time, becoming hostile to life at the most prominent of Flood infections. 343 Guilty Spark, speaking of believing in a way he couldn't explain that there exists a way to cure the Flood. All of this is explainable if we accept that the Flood are a neural physical corruption within the cosmological framework we've established in this series. They are corrupt precursors, and the precursors themselves were transcendent beings, at one with the universe, within the neural physical plane of existence. Death didn't bother them because they knew it wasn't final. It was not even an inconvenience, it was just the beginning of another cycle. The Flood are corrupted precursors, which means the Flood are corrupted neural physics. And as for the suggested cure that ancient humanity somehow got their hands on, as we covered in part 4 of this series, ancient humanity seemed closer to neural physics than the foreigners were. They were evolving technologically on a different trajectory, but to similar ends. It seems logical that if they understood the Flood were neural physical in nature, that allowed them the edge they needed to find a way to counter them. Then instead of attacking the Flood biologically, ancient humanity disrupted their informational coherence. They attacked them at their source. But the only way that they could attack the Flood, a neural physical corruption at its source, was to send neural physical information to that source. So whatever that inoculation may have entailed, they gave it to a third of their population and sacrificed themselves to Flood infection, sending whatever that inoculation was back to its source. And this is why the foreigners were ultimately ill-prepared to handle a threat like the Flood, because they believed the Flood to be a biological threat, when in reality it was a neural physical threat, simply manifesting through biology. It's why none of their defenses worked. It's why none of their weapons worked. It's why the foreigners were doomed to failure from the beginning, and why ultimately the precursors wanted humanity to be the holders of the mantle instead of the foreigners, because humanity intrinsically understood neural physics, where the foreigners were blind to it. The Flood are not a disease. They are a shadow of reality. A pattern-deep corruption encoded into the substrate of the universe. Their hunger isn't biological. It's metaphysical. Their mind is not emergent, it is eternal. The Foreigners failed because they fought the symptom, not the cause. In our final episode, we confront the ultimate failure, the creation of mendicant bias, a tool designed to defeat a physical threat, yet destined to be subverted by a metaphysical one. This is the bias fallacy, and we will finally sum up the grand unified theory of Halo cosmology and present the Halo theory of everything. And until next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, kindly tap that like button, and if you're not already subscribed and want to see more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. Pop a comment down below telling me what you thought of today's video, or if you want me to cover something specific in the near future. I want to take this opportunity to thank and give shoutouts to my patrons and YouTube supporters, Spartan10148, my singular contender class Ancilla, the triumvirate of minds within my installations Metarch, Falcon, Jordan and Poseidon, my 7 installation monitors, Sophia, Ashley, Esoteric, Spartan1029, Chris, Orion and Shane, the crush of sub-monitors, Legion, Ryan, Lebrat, Spartan0137, Element 0, J3, Cult, Evermore's, Personal Devil, Scion Esports, Phantasma, Ashton and 191 Shaken Lightbulb, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my most loyal of Enforcers, and every single one of the awesome people supporting the channel over on Patreon. My Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members, Spartan137, again, Maury, Jimbo and Balaz, and all other YouTube members keeping my installation functional on that glorious vacuum energy. I cannot thank you all enough. Shout out to John because... And if you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting the channel on one of the support links in the description to net yourself some tasty merch and help keep the channel going. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.